Welcome to everyone. Hello to you. Today is the first Thursday after the second Monday in October. And you're probably scratching your head thinking, what in the world does that mean? It means nothing. But in not too long, it's going to be the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, which is a big day in the United States. That is our election day, November 3rd. That is a day which embodies an American principle, so much so that Cisco and other companies have gone ahead and announced that day as a voting day off. So all of our employees around the globe on days where elections coincide, our employees have off. And for us here in the United States, that is November 3rd. Thanks everyone for joining. Trust me, you are going to be glad you did. And without further ado, what I would like to do is introduce our panelists, or more accurately, have them introduce themselves. So you're going to know how happy you are that you joined, and you still have an opportunity to invite friends for the invitation out and have folks join as the time goes forward. You're going to really enjoy and value the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Maggie to introduce herself. Maggie, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me. I am not muted. Good. I'm Maggie McAlpine. I'm an election security specialist, and I'm one of the co-founders of the DEF CON Voting Machine Hacking Village. Here to tell you about election security.
Perfect. Love it. Thank you, Maggie. We're going to move over to Michael Daniel.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, which is a consortium of cybersecurity companies and providers that share threat intelligence with each other.
Terrific. Thank you, Michael. Up next is Matt Olney.
Hi, I'm Matt Olney. I'm the Director of Threat Intelligence and Interdiction for Cisco Systems, and we've just completed a 4-year-long investigation into election security.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. And Rachel with the grooves, I must say. I'm not sure if everyone saw that, but Rachel.
Yes, my name is Rachel Toback. I am a human hacker, so I'll be talking about the human element of security today.
So here's the deal. As I mentioned, you are going to be happy you joined. What I think is really cool is, as we heard from the introductions, we have experts from many of the different facets of the election system and election process. So this isn't your normal election security or election conversation. And I'm actually really excited to get engaged with this conversation. So right out of the gate, we've got a lot of optimism in the air. So why don't we keep that optimism going to fuel the confidence of everyone to get out and vote on November 3rd? I'm just going to open it right out to the panel. What can we be optimistic about in terms of election security?
Right. Well, I'll just say that just the fact that we're even having this panel is amazing. Because, 10 years ago when I first got into this field, you would talk to people about election security, their eyes would glaze over. And yet now there's all this fire, all this enthusiasm. Turnout is record. I heard rumors that in California, they had to turn poll worker volunteers away. They had 3 times more than they needed. So just, people are engaged in this issue. People are fighting hard for this issue, and they're, and they care. And that's the most you can ever hope for.
I think another aspect of it is that the system is actually quite resilient. It's designed to be resilient against a number of different potential problems. And so fortunately, that also means that it's resilient in many ways against cyber threats and those kinds of threats. So there's actually a great deal of resiliency that's built into the system that means that it's actually very, very challenging to change the results of an election, particularly at the national level, and have that kind of impact.
I'm optimistic because of the men and women who actually administer the elections. I've gotten to know them over the last 4 years. I can tell you the last few months have not been easy on them, but they have risen to the challenge, and they are actively trying to reach out to the electorate to let them know what to expect in 2020. And I think that's an important role that they're doing now.
I think it also might be a little strange to say, but since my focus is so much on social media and how that impacts folks, I'm actually optimistic about the fact that the Twitter hack already happened this year. That was a social engineering attack where the attackers texted or pretended to be customer or tech support for customer support. They called them up and were able to siphon out credentials and MFA over the phone. And they were able to gain access to the admin panel, which allowed them to tweet out from former President Barack Obama, Joe Biden. And as tough as it was to watch earlier in July, I'm very thankful that that exploit was burned in July and not used and saved for November. So I think people are on higher alert now about how their platforms could be used for disinformation.
Well said. We're off to a great start around the optimism that surrounds it. And those are just a few tidbits top of mind from the panelists. So we have the right backdrop to be optimistic and to be confident about getting out there and voting. So in the world we live in, we can't turn away from news stories and coverage around election security. It's a hot topic. It's been front and center even on off years, and it started to heat up as you'd expect over the last year. So why don't we again go around the panel and share with the audience what your pet peeves are when it comes to discussing election security, like we're doing right now.
I can go first. So I guess I think one of my pet peeves is a lot of times there's a lot of little routine stories that get blown up during an election year. For example, the ballots that got misplaced, or the person who was able to request a ballot for their wife, things like that. Those things are, obviously the fact that we know about them means they got caught. And that actually means the system is quite resilient and it's working. So these things being blown up, a lot of times if you follow up, you'll actually find out that stories that were hysterically sort of augmented have turned out to be quite small in the reality. We've got a very resilient system, but also little things do happen. And that's not necessarily a sign of a catastrophe. That's often a sign that we've caught these problems early. And so that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. These things are often quite routine, even if, we always want to try to patch things and keep things going smoothly. Don't augment a story that seems like knee-jerk really bad. Like it could actually be not that big a deal, or routine, or maybe even a sign things are working. Like if the ballot's taking longer to count, it could actually be we're trying to get everything right.
I love that, Maggie. My big pet peeve is when I'm talking to folks out just in the world and they say to me, well, Rachel, my vote's not going to make a difference. What if the election is hacked? What if my vote is compromised or tampered with? And to that, I always say to them, the only way to ensure a 100% success rate of your vote being compromised or having your vote, quote unquote, not count in an election is if you choose not to vote. That is the only way you can ensure 100% compromise. And so vote, exercise your right. That is the biggest pet peeve for me.
And I think for me, it's along the lines of what Maggie was talking about. It's like acting like a lot of these problems are in fact new. In many ways, they're not new. Some of the ways they're manifesting are new due to, the fact that we've got a lot more digital dependence now on our election system than we had in the past. But many of these issues and problems are, as Maggie said, they're actually quite routine. They've happened in many previous elections, and it does not, in fact, undermine the legitimacy of the overall process. It's not a catastrophe. And so blowing those things out of proportion really does a disservice to the overall issue. Because there are real threats, and there are things that we should be concerned about. But we also need to be careful not to blow things out of proportion.
Yeah, I think my pet peeve is self-inflicted wounds. We've got foreign adversaries that are actively trying to manipulate public sentiment and take other actions, and an entire national security apparatus kind of working against that effort, only to have it undermined by American actors who are spreading disinformation. So that's kind of my pet peeve is we have enough trouble from the outside without creating our own.
Absolutely, we don't need those unforced errors. It's just not necessary at all.
Agreed. Great pet peeves there. If a pet peeve can be great, nonetheless they're real. I'm sure all of you can relate to them. So let's start the drill a little deeper. A little more specific if we can. Michael, I'm going to come to you with a question. We know involvement in the election system has federal interests, state interests, county interests. There are system interests. There are process interests. It's beneath the surface. It's a very comprehensive system. So the question for you really, whose responsibility is it to protect elections anyway? I'm going to come to you with that one, if you don't mind, Michael.
Sure. I mean, it's actually quite a complicated question, and I will say that the responsibility is a shared one, and that's not a cop-out. That's not a dodge. The truth is that our election systems are very diverse. As you mentioned, they're actually run at the state and local level in this country. And so that means a piece of the responsibility lies at the state and local level. But it's also true that, we, as Matt referenced, there are foreign adversaries that are trying to cause harm and disrupt the elections. And so there is also a federal part of the responsibility that's there. And so it's really a shared responsibility among all the different levels of government, the cybersecurity industry that also helps work with those, and all of us. Because I'm sure that Rachel can talk about all the different ways that the human link is really the most important one. So it's unfortunate to say, but it really is a shared responsibility, and that's part of what makes this issue so hard and so complicated. But it's also part of the strength of the system as well at the same time.
Yeah, I agree completely with what Michael said, that it's a challenge, but it's also part of the strength of the system, and it ultimately does rest on all of the people protecting election infrastructure. So that's from your volunteers to election officials, Secretary of State, folks running for office have to protect their own security and privacy. And so making sure that you stay safe and secure, avoid data leakage, avoid password reuse, multi-factor authentication use has to be in place. All of those things are on the onus of each individual and the organizations, and that's everyone.
Excellent. So just about 4 years ago, we had our last presidential election in 2016. I'll let that hang there. But the question, and Matt Olney, I know you've been involved with elections for a long, long time. So I would love for you to compare, contrast, and talk about how election security is different in 2020 than it was in 2016.
Right. So, I mean, the United States has done a ton of work in the last 4 years, and I think it's underappreciated how much the election community has done, how much the federal government has done in their appropriate role in the election. For example, in 2016, like if you put yourself before the DNC hacks, there just wasn't an awareness of foreign interference, or even it wasn't even on the radar of most Americans. Election security was about integrity and the proper conveyance of votes, and it was not something that was top of mind. And I think the most important change in 2020 from 2016 is like across the board in talking to election security people across the nation over the last 4 years, but particularly in the last 18 months, last 24 months. A complete dedication and engagement to getting it right, and understanding. After we did a brief in Ohio, I was lucky enough to talk to all of the county election heads, and afterwards, someone came up and they're like, "So this is really a problem?" Like, yeah, no, this is a real problem. And there was sometimes doubt about whether foreign actors were truly doing this, but you can lay out what's happening, and that engagement level is more important than anything else, because it leads to more cooperation, because they recognize that they're under-resourced and need help. There's a guy at DHS named Matt Masterson who has spent the last 4 years crisscrossing the country, building bridges between the federal government and state and local election agencies, trying to avoid a repeat of what was kind of a cluster in 2016 in terms of a response to Russian activity. So we're in a much better place in terms of coordination, if anything else.
You talked about activity, and oftentimes in this current election cycle have heard comments that government agencies aren't seeing activity like that in 2016, and then the next day or the next hour or the next news cycle, I hear that those very governments, as you mentioned, are very active in trying to influence the election. Why are we hearing the disparity there?
I'd like to hear Michael's take on this, but I kind of want to set it up a little bit. When we talk about election security, when we started our investigation in 2016 in election security, for us, it was a technical problem. We were like, okay, there are computers and they run elections, and we're going to go make sure that they're patched and that there's firewalls and there's procedures and policies. As we started digging in and comparing our understanding of the threat actors that are involved, what their intent was, what they were trying to do, what we realized was what we were seeing in terms of foreign action against election systems wasn't about changing the vote. It was about going after the public's faith in elections. And so when you hear the government saying there's foreign interference in elections, that isn't just they're interfering from a cybersecurity perspective, but they're going after the minds of American voters. And I think that's a lot of what you're hearing in terms of what the government's concerned about in terms of visible activity. Michael?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would really divide this space into a couple of different categories. So you have the hard electoral infrastructure, and that's the part that Matt was referring to that actually enables the elections to be run. So that's your voter registration databases, your poll books, the voting machines, the tabulation process, all of that infrastructure and IT equipment that actually allows the voting to happen and the elections to happen. Then there's the campaign space and what's going on with the political campaigns. And then there's the general information space that sort of all of us inhabit. And I think what we saw in 2016 was efforts across all three of those and attempts to intrude into voter registration databases and electoral systems. And that was actually where a lot of the focus was in 2016. But actually, as we learned after the election and as we did, and we went and we did the historical look and we did the look back, we actually realized there was as much, if not more, activity in the other two areas. And so what we've seen, I think, in this election cycle is our adversaries have really focused on the disinformation space and focused on the campaigns. And they have not expended as many resources, at least to the extent that any of our cybersecurity companies or the government have been able to detect. They really haven't spent much effort on the actual electoral infrastructure. And we could get into why that might be, but I think a large part of it has to do with exactly what Matt said. If your goal is really to cause disruption, if it's really to just undermine Americans' faith in the electoral process, then using disinformation is way more effective in terms of return on dollar invested than trying to go after that electoral infrastructure. And it's probably a lot less likely to result in retaliation as well. So just any way you slice it, it's a much more effective tool from the adversary's perspective.
And on that point, I think we've set ourselves and we've signaled to our adversaries that there's a line there, because if you look back over, I think the summer of 2018, where there was a revelation that there were some counties in Florida hacked, the governor of Florida kind of stepped up the podium. The first thing he said was the first thing I want to tell you is that no votes were affected. We've flagged to our adversaries that there's a difference between affecting votes and disinformation campaigns, and they're going towards that side.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when I think about it as from an attacker perspective. For me, it's cheaper and faster for me to disenfranchise folks than for me to actually penetrate your systems, right? And so that's, if I'm an attacker and I'm getting into that mindset, that's what I'm going to go after. I'm going to do the easiest, fastest, cheapest thing that I can do.
Makes sense. Anything else to layer in here, Maggie?
Oh, well, I would just say that, and it's also, what does it matter if you change the tabulation if you stop people from showing up in the first place and target that effectively? It's also fiendishly difficult to prove, when did somebody change their mind? But also, how do you prosecute it, especially if domestic actors and people at home right now listening to this start augmenting those messages? How do you shut that down? So it's incredibly difficult to go after. And I can understand what they're saying about this is the low hanging fruit, is the disinformation campaigns.
Right. Probably a good time to pivot as we all of you just started to touch on some of the facets that our audience can relate to here. And Rachel, I'm going to come to you next. And as my mind's formulating this, so if there was a human attack on an individual involved in the election system, what would that look like for our audience to know? And how can we all defend against it? I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Well, I have a really good example. We have examples of human attacks, social engineering against election officials and folks in charge. These come through phone and email. So let's talk through the one famous example of Podesta. Podesta received an email from noreply@accounts.googlemail.com. The subject was, someone has your password, and the body of that email was, someone used your password to try and sign into your Google account on March 19th in Ukraine. Google has stopped this sign-in, and you should change your password immediately. And they linked to a bit.ly link, which is a shortened URL. And so the help desk reached out to John and said, hey, looks like you have a problem. Looks like you've been compromised. You need to change your password. But what happened is a person who went ahead and changed John's password accidentally clicked that bit.ly link instead of going directly to Google to change that password. And we know the rest is history, right? We were able to gain access to those emails and he was compromised. So to defend against it, this is something that really goes home for everybody, is to navigate to known sites instead of clicking links within those emails. Use 2 methods of communication to confirm people are who they say they are. I call that being politely paranoid. And we have to use multi-factor authentication. And if you are in a position of power, like Podesta, you have to have hardware authentication. So something like a YubiKey or a Google Titan key rather than SMS 2-factor. Great Aunt Linda can probably use SMS 2-factor just fine, but John Podesta, he should probably have a YubiKey.
Well said. And the techniques or the methods to defend against that you shared, as comprehensive and complex a system it may sound, those measures are very straightforward and simple. So thanks for sharing. So in that regard, you mentioned social engineering. How is human emotion? How is our emotion a target for these types of attacks?
Human emotion is a massive target for disinformation because when we're going after a human being, we're trying to get to their emotional core because the emotional part of our brain actually works quicker than the rational part of our brain. This is actually called amygdala hijacking. I studied neuroscience and behaviorism, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but kind of how this works is the brain structure of the amygdala handles all of the emotional processing for us. Kind of like that fight or flight feeling. You get that before you have a chance to think and wonder what exactly is going on here, right? It's how we can, lift a car off of somebody. It's a good thing. We don't want to turn it off. But it also means that attackers can leverage that against us by trying to hijack our amygdala. And so when I think as an attacker myself, white hat, of course, when I'm trying to disenfranchise someone or affect somebody in some way, I'm going to go for that amygdala hijack. I'm going to have some heavily emotional content there that's going to convince them to take an action that's probably not in their best interest. Something like retweeting immediately before reading, right? Sending information via text or WhatsApp, for instance, to a group of friends. Something that we're seeing this disinformation and this disenfranchisement propagate very quickly. And that's because our rational centers of our brain have not yet turned on before we have a chance to think when our amygdala is hijacked with that emotional content.
Love it. Makes perfect sense. Thanks for dumbing it down for me, because it makes a lot of sense when you say it, and appreciate that. What I'd like to do now is we're a few weeks out from Election Day here in the United States, and Maggie, it's probably going to end up being a combo, Maggie Michael, but Maggie, what should voters expect in these next few weeks leading up to Election Day? And then I'll give you the preview of my follow-on question. It's going to be the weeks that follow as well. And then we're going to focus in on one night. And Michael, I'm going to come to you for that one. But Maggie, would you enlighten us on this?
Well, sure. Obviously, people are going to be starting to vote. And one thing that you may have already seen this is like there's been long lines in certain places. And that can be due to a host of reasons, not always related to, mismanagement or anything going wrong. For example, in early voting stages, just there's often fewer poll workers or fewer people on staff. So you've gotten this immense rush of enthusiasm, which has led to some very long lines. One thing you should do is make a voting plan. Now, the voting plan might not necessarily be that you can't show up on election day because you may be in a rural area, you might be in a smaller polling place, you've never had a problem before, and you probably won't have one again. But if you are a reasonable adult or human being who may not be able to stand in line for 2 hours or more when we have this immense rush of enthusiasm on election day, you might want to start thinking about things like if your state allows it, requesting and returning immediately your absentee ballot, or setting aside some time to go vote, early voting, or setting some time aside on election day. I would actually suggest against showing up first thing in the morning if you have the option to not do that. Only because that is, as a poll worker for many years, I've noticed that is the most busy time. Contrary to what some people may think. So basically, you're going to see, totally aside from politics and all of that noise, you're going to see a lot of stuff about long lines. You're going to see a lot of stuff about get out to vote. Please, please, please. We've been talking about flattening the curve all year. Flatten the curve on your absentee ballot if you have at all the option to send it in immediately. That gives more time to correct your ballot if something has gone wrong. It's more time for people to process it. And it gives just, more time for this long turnaround if you are in a place affected by USPS slowdowns.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I
Makes
think
sense. Go ahead.
and I think we'll also see, our adversaries will continue to ramp up their activities. So you will see attempts to spread disinformation, and they will take small stories and try to amplify those small quirks or small problems that happen someplace and try to make them into big problems, and amplify those stories. They may take a small malfunction in an IT system someplace that's actually just a result of human error or just a glitch, and try to magnify that out of proportion. So if anything, you would expect the cadence of that to increase over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'll steal the slot now for a bit of a public service announcement. In my home state of Virginia, tolerate early voting, and I'm proud to say I voted weeks ago, and it was a piece of cake, very smooth process, and proud to have been able to do so in that regard. So that's a good conceptual lead-in to Election Day. So, Michael, why don't we stay with you for 1 minute just to keep the sequence, the timeline sequence in line. That actual night, election night, assuming you voted, but whether absentee, early, or day of, what should voters expect on that night across the country?
Well, I think we are likely to see something that we have not seen in a while, which is that it is very likely that we will not know the final results of the election, the unofficial results from the election on election night. Now, here's the truth. We've never had the official results on election night. It always actually, in fact, takes several weeks for the election authorities at the local and then the state level to actually certify the results. It's just that we have gotten very used to those, red and blue maps and projections and unofficial results all coming in so that we knew who the winner was on election night. And the truth is that that's never actually been the case. What I think we're going to, because it's never been the case, because that's how the system actually works, is that it takes some time for those results to be certified and become official. What I think we're likely to see this time, though, is that even the unofficial results won't be available because of the number of absentee ballots, because of the potential for some long lines and other factors. Like Maggie said earlier, everybody being very, very aware of the potential for disruption, so really wanting to make sure they got it right. So taking more time before they even release unofficial results. So I think what we may see is a much slower process than we've become used to over the last few election cycles. But it's important to remember that that does not mean that things are going wrong. As I said, it's how the system is actually supposed to work. And it does not mean that there's a catastrophe or somebody has hacked the election or that there's something that's illegitimate that's happening. It actually means that we may be following the process, the regular, normal process.
I love that. And I think communicating it in that way, saying if it takes a little bit of extra time, that's a message to you that the process is actually working, that people are checking the ballots. They're making sure everything's authentic. That should be an indicator to us like, great, everything's on schedule. It's going great. We have to have those conversations with the people in our lives that expect it to take days and weeks. Don't go into it expecting the balloons and the confetti that night. You're not going to get it. There's the slimmest of possibilities that we could potentially know some information that night that's useful. But the vast, vast majority of the projections are indicating that it's going to take days, if not weeks, to figure that out. So if you can communicate that to the family in your life that's not on this call today and sit down with them and say, this is what you need to expect. When you see that, you know it's working. That's going to really stop that disenfranchisement. It's going to stop the disinformation that's likely to come.
Excellent points. And Rachel, you said it so eloquently. I was going to suggest that I wish everyone could hear the combination of those messages, because that night is filled with excitement and question and uncertainty. And what you both just reinforced adds some calm to that. And thanks for sharing those expectations. So keeping this timeline going, Maggie, we're going to come back to you. And even though Rachel and Michael talked on it a bit, there are weeks that will follow election night, in addition to what Rachel just referenced. what do those look like? What should voters expect during that time period?
Well, and they're going to see some stuff they've actually maybe seen before in previous years, but just not been aware of. If, I'm just throwing out an example. New York State is late on getting all of its ballots in on the federal election. Generally speaking, no one's really been, zoomed in on that because they kind of knew where New York State was going. So this has been happening before. You just might not have known. So there's going to be states that there's two types of absentee ballot states, right? There's ones that you have to have your ballot in by election night, and that'll be counted, roughly the same time as all the other ballots that day. But there's also states, quite a few states, I'm not even going to list them because it's like more than a dozen, that are postmark date. And that means that up to a week or more after the election, they could still be receiving and counting ballots. And that means that they're not giving the official canvassed, certified results yet. Now, fingers crossed, it's not a state that's actually going to impact who won, but it could be. So during that time, we could very well be seeing a lot of angst, a lot of misinformation, foreign and domestic, people who are maybe not malicious, but just partisan and excited, seeing every single sway of the polls as those come in, meaning something good or bad or exciting or disappointing. And it could be a very emotional time. So that's the time where we really want people to maybe not augment something if it's not from a trusted source, like a Secretary of State's office or a trusted news outlet. Don't assume that everything is out to get you, every little bit of news, or out to get your party or candidate or choice on the ballot, going all the way down the ballot. There's just, it could go very many ways. And there could be things, for example, you may have heard about the blue shift or the red mirage, where rural small areas are able to get their results in sooner and counted, and large cities may be struggling to keep up in a boom year like this. So again, those are not necessarily bad things. I've been a poll worker before. In some places, it's a 12-hour or more day. We are exhausted at the end of the day. Even just on a normal election, just being able to have until the next day to get the results in would be great. We'd love that kind of patience. It could be longer than that this year. But fingers crossed. Again, please don't panic. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Excellent. Thanks, Maggie. I see the makings of a What to Expect When You're Voting book, potentially here, co-authored by the...
What to expect when you're electing?
Yes. The better. Thank you.
You're welcome. I didn't make it up.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. We're getting closer to time here, and I think, Rachel, it was you who mentioned your pet peeve was that your vote doesn't make a difference, when in actuality we know it makes an incredible difference for all the reasons you articulated. But even further than that, we all have a part. We all play a part as voters to help secure the elections and our elections. So let's talk about actions the audience can take. What can the average everyday voter, not that anyone's average, but what can that voter do to help support the election integrity, prevent this disinformation we've talked about, interference to the extent it comes, and at the end of the day, protect our democracy? We'll go, I'm thinking Rachel first. I just see you there leaning on the seat.
Well, you're going to come across content that is amygdala hijacking. You're going to see stuff that's emotional. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram have all put out messages that their terms of service have changed and that they do not allow this content that's amygdala hijacking, that's disinformation or voter disenfranchisement on their platforms. Some as recently as 2 weeks ago announced this. And so if you see this and you're a social media user, report that content. They have scaled out their teams like crazy to be able to accommodate all of the reporting that's going to come in at this time. So allow your rational brain to take over. Give yourself a few minutes to calm down before you think about it. It takes a few minutes to come down from an adrenaline rush, which you've probably noticed if you've ever, stubbed your toe or something like that before. So take a few minutes. Don't share until you have your rational brain take over and look it all up and make sure it's all accurate, and then report disinformation. Everybody can take that and safeguard the democracy that we have here in the integrity of our election.
Excellent. Good general rule of thumb across the board. Thanks for sharing. Let's go around the horn here. Anyone else with some guidance or suggestions for the voting audience?
Well,
Go ahead, Michael.
Matt. I think from my perspective, it's several of those things too. It's don't panic. To go back to Maggie's point, which is that I think that there's a lot of reasons, as we said at the top of this, to have optimism and faith in the resiliency of the system, and that there are a lot of people at the state and local level and at the federal level that are working very hard on this, and that will be in the background prepared to deal with any real problems if they actually emerge, and that there are entire teams dedicated to this that are focused on this problem, and that's something that people should take confidence in. I think in many ways it's also applying that same skepticism that your grandmother probably talked to you about, or your parents talked to you about, of if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. A lot of those same skepticisms and ways that we approach advertising and other things we need to be applying to the general information space that we now live in, and that many of those same principles will apply. And I very much want to second what Rachel said of, that give yourself time to think and actually ask questions. Allow that slow thinking part of your brain, as Daniel Kahneman would call it, to have time to catch up with the fast thinking part of your brain, so that you can actually apply those rational filters to what you're seeing and what you're doing. And I think that is actually a rule that is probably going to extend well beyond the issues around the election, just because of the nature of the information space that we all now inhabit.
Yeah, I think we have to add to that rule, like, just if it seems too bad to be true, it's also probably not right. So just the way things go. I would say, as we, especially as you start to make your voting plan, as Maggie was laying out for you, or as you are going through election night and trying to understand what's happening, the first thing you need to know is, in the United States, there's no central election authority. Every state is its own kind of entity, and in many cases within the state, every county is its own entity. In some states that I've worked with, the state doesn't even have any say over what counties purchase for election gear. So, like, that's the level of autonomy that we've given counties to run elections. But what I would say is that means that the experts in your elections are the people that live next to you, in turn, like they are in your community. And if you probably aren't following them on Twitter, I follow a lot of them. And so I just kind of want to repeat what Amanda Grandjean said. She's the Ohio Director of Elections. She's a deputy Assistant Secretary of State there. And she says, if you do not know the answer to something election related, please, for the love of all things, ask an election official before you make up an answer. Inform voters. It is more than okay to ask for the answer. Please don't inadvertently spread misinformation. And as someone who 4 years ago knew nothing about elections and had to kind of go hat in hand to the elections officials, like, please teach me kind of what's going on so I can help give you better advice. These are complex systems, and those complex systems have a lot of checks and balances in them that you never see, in terms of physical security, in terms of chain of custody, in terms of revalidation. In many states now that we're seeing, data science being applied after elections to kind of check the integrity of the elections. All of this takes time. So if you have a question, what the election community has been saying for the last couple of months, loud and clear, is please call them and ask them. That's their job. And they would much rather you ask the question to them than you to forward something incorrect and complicate their jobs and kind of pollute the minds of Americans. Ultimately, this is an election security discussion, and we spend a lot of time on disinformation. And so what you need to understand is what we're saying to you is disinformation is part of election security. And as Rachel said earlier, I'll kind of paraphrase, all security problems are human problems. Patches don't fix things, working with the human beings on systems is what fixes things. And so we can't patch Americans, right? You can't do that. And so what we have to do is we have to adopt new ways of navigating this information state that we find ourselves in. So, all of these suggestions are important, but understand that elections aren't being targeted, you're being targeted.
Nice closing statement there. We'll let it hang. And Maggie, did you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just to add on to Matt's point, one of the challenges we face as election security people is raising awareness and concerns around elections without playing into the very plausible attack, which is people saying, well, the voting machines are going to be hacked, therefore, why should I bother to vote? And I've said this before, but you have my complete permission if you hear somebody in your life say that I'm not going to vote. I shouldn't bother. It's so dangerous. You can smack them for me very gently, and tell them that is simply not the case, and that is in fact playing into a very real and very functional attack in and of itself. So, election security awareness should be around things like, returning to paper ballots, adding more checks into the system, and hardening cybersecurity. It's not around things like tabulation is being changed. So that's actually not something we've ever confirmed in the wild. So as much as we are worried about that, no election security expert of any integrity has ever said that an election in the US has been hacked before and tabulation changed. So definitely vote. That would be basically the lesson. It is ubiquitous. Every election security expert will tell you the most important thing you can do is vote.
Don't cell phone.
Yes, well said. All right, we're getting just a few questions from the audience as we start to wind down. Maggie and Matt, your combo there, we're gonna stick with that. So you referenced it a bit in your introduction, but in addition to all the research you're doing, and it's clearly deep and wide, but I understand both of you volunteered as election workers over time to get a better feel and to get involved. And how did that experience affect your own personal understanding of elections from the ground, from being there in the actual process itself? And then knowing that, I'd love to understand what you'd recommend voters do as they head there. So decide who goes first, and let us know what you think.
I'll pass because in my county, actually, there were enough election workers that they didn't need me. I volunteered. But what I will say is that the consistent message that I've gotten from election officials everywhere is, please God, volunteer and help us. So if you want to be engaged, they're always looking for volunteers. And Maggie, I'd love to hear your experience.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, certainly it was, behooved me to become involved as an election poll worker, and I've been one in New York State and New Hampshire. Now, keep in mind, every state is different. So, your experience may be different. Like I said, California was, turning people away because they had more than they needed. For many reasons. But I would basically say, if you've ever had a concern around election security, including stories around mail-in fraud or things like that, please be a poll worker, because you'll actually see a lot of those checks and balances in process. And as a cybersecurity expert, it is very easy, and I've seen this many times, for people to kind of get their head in the clouds or think about the problem differently or think they have a solution where there isn't one. Election workers have been thinking about these problems for over 100 years. And so there's a lot of things that you might think, oh, well, we'll just technology our way out of this, which they've already solved better than, your solution. And it can be just very encouraging to see those steps, but it's also valuable if you are technologically savvy to get involved, because you might spot something that the average volunteer doesn't notice. So basically, yeah, for multiple reasons, you should definitely volunteer to be a poll worker. You'll learn so much about your community on just a social level. You'll learn so much about how civics, if you have a 17-year-old, you should press gang them into doing this, because they'll learn so much too, and you'll usually make a couple $100 for the day. It's just an incredibly rewarding thing to do, and you will for example, you'll learn just how silly some of these accusations around mail-in voter fraud is when you actually see how those get checked off and what that process looks like behind the scenes.
I love that, Maggie. I would also add that if you're scared of COVID-19, you don't want to go be a poll worker, right? I hereby knight you to work from home and help people stay calm. That can be your job, right? When you see things on Facebook, when you see your aunt posting something on Facebook, you can hereby be knighted to be the calm voter support, right? Yes, where you can support people and say, hey, listen, I hear you. That sounds like a really emotional thing that you're posting about. Let's talk about it. And let's really get to the bottom of it so that we can figure out what is disenfranchising folks and get to the bottom of all of this. So you can do things from home, even if you're not an official worker, just keeping folks calm during this, what is likely to be a long process.
Right.
And I think,
No, please, Michael, please. Yeah.
What I was going to say is, one of the things that, having sat in the White House in 2016 and really having to get, as Matt, along same experience with Matt, of suddenly having to get up to speed on this very complex infrastructure and sort of learning that, as Maggie said, if you've met one state, you've met one state. and that it's very, very different. And how Ohio does it is very different than Virginia and then New Mexico. And really, there's this very, very complex ecosystem out there that most of us have largely taken for granted because it's always just worked. And I think that for me, one of the biggest lessons has been looking into and just coming to appreciate how complex the system is and how many constraints and it actually operates under. And so just to give an example, there's, one of the things that could frustrate some people on the cybersecurity side is, why haven't the election officials patched this or that in their IT system? Well, there's actually a very good reason for that. It's not because they're stupid or because they're unaware. It's because they actually can't make changes after a certain point. Because we have some checks and balances that are built in that says we aren't going to change the system, a certain number of months ahead of the election, precisely because we've been dealing with some of these problems, as Maggie said, for 100 years. And so we've got some very good rules built in there to prevent other problems. And so, I would just say that, before you spout off about why, this or that, there's actually probably a reason why the system is working the way that it is. And it's because it's actually been designed to ensure integrity over the long term.
Excellent. All right. What we're going to do now is we're going to go around the horn just with some closing thoughts, open the mic for each of you to provide a wrap. And thanks for all the commentary thus far. So in no particular order, I'm going to come over to Maggie first for your closing thoughts, Maggie. Thank you.
I mean, I feel like I've said a lot of it. Please volunteer as a poll worker if you can. Don't panic. If you want to know more about this, there's some fantastic organizations. Follow your Secretary of State on Twitter, for example. Check out, Election Verification Network or Verified Voting. There's some fantastic, nonprofits out there with more information, especially if you're a technologist and you want to maybe help solve solutions. But before you do that, I'm begging you, please be a poll worker. Do not show up telling us how your new software is going to fix everything until you've gotten at least a little bit involved yourself. But I think we're in a good spot. I think people should be optimistic, and I think you should vote sooner rather than later, please. I am begging you if you have that option.
There you have it. I'll back that up. Easy, seamless, safe. Love it, Maggie. Now I do have an order. We're going to go around the horn in the same order we were introduced. So, Michael, you're up next.
Well, thanks. And I would just say that, the threats are real. There are adversaries out there that are trying to actively undermine Americans' faith in democracy because they want to weaken us as a nation. But that's their goal. Their goal is to weaken us as a nation. And so the right way to combat that is to not let them do that, to not let them undermine our faith in the process and to combat it that way. And so these issues are very real and we should take them very seriously. But at the same time, we should not, be breathlessly apocalyptic about the situation and have confidence that there are a lot of checks and balances built in and that there is a lot of integrity to our election process. So again, I'll just echo the go and vote. That's probably the best thing that you can do to show the adversaries that they cannot undermine us.
Breathlessly apocalyptic, not a scenario I'd like to be involved in. Well said. For those of you keeping track, Matt Olney was introduced third. And Matt, your closing thoughts, if you would.
So the thing that I would say is, this is a real fight. Like, there are people that wake up every day in other countries, and their job is to get you to act against your own best interests, and to use you to weaken the United States. And so what I would say is that everybody has a role to play. And I can guarantee you that election officials understand that. And they have taken up the fight. I would say politicians have a role to play by constantly and vigorously reinforcing their faith and their trust in American democratic ideals. And you as a voter have an obligation to do everything that Rachel and Maggie and Michael have laid out for you in terms of validating information, taking a breath before clicking forward, and knowing that if you do that, if you do forward that information, you're acting, in someone else's best interests. And that would be what I'd want to say.
I think everybody's covered everything. Like it's been perfect. The optimism is there. The election is going to go on, whether you're nervous about it or not, we're going to have to move forward. Do not buy into the chaos of everything. It's your job. I love your cat, Maggie. It is your job to stay calm. And now that you've sat in on this, it's your job to help other people stay calm too, because you know about it. And so you keep people focused on the goal. Their goal is to help forward the democratic process. If they are disenfranchised because an adversary, whether foreign or domestic, has done their job and convinced them that they shouldn't vote, well, unfortunately, they've been successful. So now it's your job to revert that and remind them that they can only be successfully owned, successfully compromised at a rate of 100% if they choose not to vote. They have to vote.
It's a really great lesson, Rachel.
Agreed.
And from you, Maggie.
No.
And Matt Blaze. Follow Matt Blaze.
Yes, Matt Blaze. Please follow him.
Well, that'll do it for today. Rachel, Maggie, Michael, Matt, thank you so much. It was an unbelievably valuable to go deep into these areas. And again, coming at this topic and the election process and security from all these different angles that we all can relate to. And what we all would do to encourage the audience is share these stories, share what you learn, share tidbits here, share the confidence that you're leaving this session with your friends, your neighbors, your family, your coworkers, etc.